And welcome to this meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission. I'm Councillor Peter Southgate, Chair of the Commission, and I'd like to introduce my fellow Commission members. Perhaps you could put your hands up, people, when I called out. Councillor Brenda Fraser, Councillor Billy Christie, Councillor Aidan Mundy, who is also chair of the Sustainable Communities panel, Councillor Paul Kohler, Councillor Mike Brunt, thank you, Mike, Councillor Nick McLean, and Councillor Ed Gretton, and Councillor Ben Butler. So I'm just counting on here. And welcome also for the first time, Ros Cordner, who is our co-opted representative from the Church of England diocese. Welcome, Ros. I think that is, and Councillor Peter McCabe, my vice chair and chair of Healthier Communities, has just joined us. Good. Can I start by asking for any declarations of pecuniary interest? There are none.
Good.
Mansour, welcome. Mansour,
Thank you.
Our co-opted member. And apologies for absence. We have potentially for lateness from Jed Curran, but otherwise I think everyone is here. The minutes of our last meeting in November, if everyone's had a chance to look at those, can I take those as an accurate record? If there is no dissent, I shall do that. And does anybody have matters arising from those? There being none, good. Right, so we had hoped to start with a presentation from Jed Curran as our Chief Executive on the current position of the Council with regard to the pandemic and the work we're doing to support the people of Merton. Unfortunately, he's sitting in a blackout, and although I hope he will join us later, we do need to move on. I think the importance of that is that we now seem to be right back where we were in many respects in March, April of last year, with as many people being shielded, and the Council is at full stretch looking after some 6,500 critically extremely vulnerable people, as well as its normal workload. So we wanted to hear about that and steps being taken to support our residents. I hope we can get to that later. Meanwhile, we have a call-in this evening, and that is starts on page 5 of your agenda. The call-in concerns the closure or proposed closure of Moranton Development at a meeting of the Council on the 22nd of, a meeting of the Moranton Development Subcommittee on the 22nd of December. And the two grounds for the call-in are a failure to act in a manner of openness and transparency, and a failure to consider and evaluate alternatives to that decision. An initial point that I'd like to deal with now, and we discussed this in a pre-meet on Monday, is whether this should properly be referred back to full council or to cabinet, or should it be decided that the decision should be reconsidered. The Constitution does require us to take advice on points like this in Part 4C, and so we did speak with our monitoring officer, Louise Round, on Monday, and I will ask Louise to, if she would repeat or give us again the advice you gave us then, Louise, about this decision and whether A, whether it's subject to call in, and B, whether it therefore is properly a matter for Cabinet or for full council.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, councillors. Yes, the matter is properly called in, which is why it's before you tonight. I'm required under the Constitution to rule whether something's a valid call-in when it first gets submitted before it gets referred to this commission, and I was happy that it was. In relation to your second question, the matter can only be referred up to full council if it's considered that the decision taken was outside the policy framework of the council, which relates to a limited number of strategies defined in the Constitution, or it's contrary to the budget. And my view, expressed on Monday and again now, is that neither of those things apply. So that if, having considered the matter tonight, you do wish the matter to be reconsidered, the proper course of action would be to refer it back either to the subcommittee or to the Cabinet to take account of your views and decide whether they wish to pursue the course of action they agreed at the back end of December last year. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Yes, I think I will take, Ed, you want to ask?
Yeah, a quick question. Thank you, Louise, for giving that advice. I did look at the Constitution briefly, and when it says what the policy framework is, it's very clearly defined, and it says housing strategy is, a big part and a defined part of the policy framework, and then it refers to the budget framework as well. And we go back to the budget meeting last year, and Moranton, the £16.5 million capital investment, was explicitly approved as part of the budget process. It was one of the key approvals, and that was the big ticket item, if you like, within the capital budget framework. So on that basis, because housing is named explicitly in the Constitution within the policy framework, and because it was the big budget item, the capital expenditure budget, which was approved, and therefore within the budget, and the Constitution does very clearly say that this commission can take a view on that, and if so, it goes back to the council and for fuller consideration. And just by way of housing strategy, if you have to Google Merton housing strategy, you'll actually see there's a housing strategy document from 2020 post-COVID, and it says our big opportunities, Moranton development. So it seems to me that there is some ground to actually ask the question for the commission to decide if housing is important as part of the council strategy. Moranton is explicitly named as the opportunity. Isn't it really, does Louise wish to reconsider her advice, and is it really better a matter for full council?
Let me, if I can take that first, with regard to the provision of the Constitution as it affects scrutiny, Part 4C, where a call-in does come to the Commission, we are required at para 5 to take the advice of the monitoring officer. It's not for us as members to decide whether it is a matter to refer back to Cabinet or to Council. We are constitutionally bound to take it.
But in the preceding paragraph in 5A, it does say where the Commission itself is of the opinion that it might be contrary to policy or budget. So there is possibility there. It does envisage that this Commission could have an opinion and take that view itself, and then and there's a process in 5B for that then triggers a monitoring officer writing a full report to every member of the council and to Cabinet and so on.
Well, we have taken, I as chair would seek the monitoring officer's advice and would advise members to do the same. But Louise, do you want to comment on this?
Yes. On the policy, I hear what you say, Councillor Gretton, but I'm still of the view that just because it relates to housing doesn't necessarily mean that it's a formal part of the policy framework to deliver that housing via the mechanism of Moranton. So I remain of the view that it's a matter for the Cabinet, not for full council to have jurisdiction over. In relation to the budget, Caroline might like to come in, but in any event, the proposal in relation to the financial implications of winding down Moranton will be considered by full council as part of the budget setting process later in this financial year. So there's not a separate mechanism to refer it up there before then.
So let's proceed on the basis of that ruling. If I can just outline how I want to run things. I do want to say first of all that when a calling comes to us, it does suggest that there has been dissatisfaction with the manner in which a decision has been taken. So we are conducting an investigation into that. This can be somewhat tense, but I would ask you please to conduct this in a disciplined and professional manner. Please direct all questions through the chair. Please don't interject when other people are speaking, and we will sort of hear each other out in a courteous fashion. So I'm going to ask, the two people in support of the calling. I don't know whether that's going to be Stephen and...
Sorry, Chair, if I may interject here. We've had a slight deviation from, we advised Rosie beforehand that Councillor Crowe will be presenting. As he's not a member of the panel, we thought it more concise that he present the call-in, and Councillors Greta and myself will obviously be on the questioning panel.
No, that's absolutely fine. Yes, I agree with your logic there. So, Councillor Crowe, we're going to give you 4 minutes. You'll get a warning after you with 1 minute to go, and I will then invite Chris Lee and Councillor Allison to respond. Off you go, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. My colleagues and I have called in the decision made by the Memorandum Subcommittee on the 21st of December last year, because in our opinion, there was a lack of openness and an inadequate consideration of alternatives. I'd like to thank council officers for the papers. They usefully set the scene, but in my opinion, they do not answer the concerns raised for consideration this evening. I accept that the administration and council officers have taken the decision to wind up Memorandum with a heavy heart. And I believe this sentiment is shared by many councillors in opposition and by many residents. I would like to make the following 3 points in respect of a lack of openness. First, details of the company's future expenditure and past expenditure do not appear to have been presented to the subcommittee. Indeed, although we are in month 10 of the current year, statutory accounts for the previous year, that is the year ended 31st of March 2020, have not yet been filed with Companies House. Secondly, Appendix C from page 27 onwards in the report contains information that, in my opinion, should have been presented to the subcommittee when it made its decision. Thirdly, based upon the papers presented to various meetings of the subcommittee, it would appear that since the formation of the company 3 years ago, administrative costs have exceeded £1 million. The majority of this spend relates to staff costs. Yet the papers presented to the subcommittee make no mention of the impact of the proposed winding up on our staff. Turning to the issue of inadequate consideration of alternatives, I would again like to make 3 points. First, on page 8 at paragraph 6.7, the decision of the subcommittee is rationalised as being the result of the impact of COVID-19 and post-Brexit market conditions. Whilst these are undoubtedly relevant to the short and medium term, other factors surely must be relevant to a development running to 2050, and yet these have not been presented for consideration. Secondly, may I draw members to page 12. At paragraph 3, we see that 2 alternatives are presented: develop 3 sites and sell all sites. Given that there are 4 sites in 3 wards, there surely must be more than 2 viable options for consideration. Finally, I would direct members' attention to page 13, where they see at paragraph 6.5 of the paper presented to the subcommittee that the return on investment reduces from 6.48% to 2.94% over a 30-year period.
You have 1 minute left, Councillor.
Thank you. Surely it does not make sense to wind up a company that will meet a community need and is expected to make a positive return on investment. Yet this point of view is not analysed in the briefing paper. For the 6 reasons I've outlined, I hope that members will resolve to refer this decision to a full council meeting or to Cabinet for fresh consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Am I going to call on Chris now to respond?
Happy to, Chair. Thank you. And I'll come to Councillor Crow's questions in a moment, but Councillor Crow introduced the questions by saying that he acknowledged that it was with a heavy heart this recommendation came forward, and it was because the company had been established for 3 years and we had high hopes for it. And the company was set up with a single purpose. And later on, I'll invite Roger Kershaw and James McGinley, the directors of the company, to talk through some of the financial issues that they faced. It was set up with a single purpose, and it was intended to deliver a profit to the organisation for the benefit of council taxpayers. But the circumstances changed, and we'll go through some of those financial circumstances that changed that operating environment and changed the financial outlook considerably. And in view of those changed circumstances and the facts, the company, I can see, had to change its position. And I can fully see why members might reach a conclusion about the lack of openness and the speed in which this decision was taken. But just to start with that point, my understanding is that the company took that decision early in the late autumn of last year because the circumstances had changed. The audit was about to commence, and they could see that they would not be able to show that the organisation, the company, was a going concern. And rather than that emerging as part of an audit process, the company, through their review, concluded that it was better to take the action that's set out in the papers here and to bring that forward to the shareholders and the shareholder representatives, and they did so as a responsible company. And the issues are set out in the papers here. The financial issues I'll come to in a moment, and I'll ask James and Roger to cover the issue about Companies House and the lack of evidence that papers accounts have been filed. I'm not aware of that, and I'm sure they'll be able to cover that point. To pick up on the issue of the costs that have been incurred, it is correct that over £1 million, around £2.1 million, has been spent by Moranton, and that's entirely on either seconded staff, and that's James McGinley and Paul McGarry for a portion of their working week. This isn't additional bonus payments. This is an accounting measure to cover their costs for their work that they're doing on Moranton, as opposed to their salary being paid by the authority directly. So this isn't additional cost incurred, but this is a secondment cost. And the other costs are in relation to appropriate consultants' fees, whether those are legal or planning, all involved in preparation of the planning applications and other associated documentation. So the impact on those staff isn't an impact that you might imagine in terms of redundancy or staff being exited from the organisation. It is the fact that those secondment payments will no longer be required. So James and Paul, who are the members of staff affected, are aware of those circumstances and will go back to their substantive roles for 5 days a week. So in terms of that, the staff impact has been considered and fully accounted for. In terms of the implications, Councillor Crow refers to page 8, para 6.7, and this being a consequence of COVID and Brexit. There is no way that we are seeking to present this as a consequence solely of COVID and Brexit. They are marginal matters almost certainly. And the main factors behind the financial circumstances changing, which Roger and James will go through, I'm sure, in a bit more detail, are particularly around the matters that I'll come to in a moment, which are firstly around the change in the Public Work Loan Board rate, which changed in October 2019 to increase 1% to the borrowing costs of the council, which would then be passed on to Moranton. And that substantially changed the amount that they would need to pay and undermined the business case. That subsequently changed again on the 26th of November, but that was after Moranton had made their decision. And that sat alongside other economic financial factors that undermined the credibility of the business case. The second factor was around the construction cost increase, which have been assumed at one level, and then all of the analysis and evidence that was emerging, not just in autumn of last year, but in the prevailing months, the previous months before that, were suggesting that those assumptions were wrong and the construction costs were going up. So the facts changed in that particular area, again undermining the business case. The more significant factor, though, was that around house price inflation, where assumptions in the original business plan were sound, but the circumstances again changed, whether related to COVID, whether related to Brexit, the London housing market, a cocktail of matters, I suspect, but the house price inflation, which directly affects the rental income that Moranton would enjoy and would use to pay the loan back to the authority, changed. And that was one of the biggest factors that you'll see in the spreadsheet, which changed the underlying business case. And then there were other factors around the potential change demand for PRS, which probably bleed in to the house price inflation. So COVID and Brexit were certainly there, but there were real hard-edged expert analysis and advice that was showing that the financial foundation and the assumptions that had been made were changing and had changed. And then a further less important, less significant matter for the council to take into account, which I'm sure Caroline will touch upon as necessary, is around guidance to local authorities about borrowing for investments which are purely about generating a yield and the need for the authority to take that into account. Now, that's not a factor that Moranton took into account because that wasn't germane to their decision making, but it is a council issue. And this is a wholly owned company. So Moranton had been preparing to consider a review in the autumn. They looked at the circumstances, reached an appropriate conclusion and presented that to the council in order for us to consider it. We didn't disagree with any of their conclusions and so brought this to members at the earliest opportunity in December. And that was the reason for the pace and the need for us to take that decision early. In terms of alternative options, there really are no credible alternative options, and I know that Moranton looked at those. As you can see from the papers in the appendices, selling a combination of different sites within the portfolio was suboptimal compared to the option that's been selected. And this leaves us still with the potential to show a profit, but it will be down to the final sale price of these sites. And that's not within the gift of Moranton. The sites did not transfer to Moranton. So they've decided to make this decision at the best time in the circumstances and taken the right option, rejecting any alternatives which are suboptimal. And in terms of Councillor Crow's last point around the 6.9 to 2.9% return, the conclusion that Moranton took, which is a conclusion that we agree with, is that for that level of return over a 30-year period, it really wasn't in the authorities and the company's interest to take on that level of risk. The return was so far off, and with the prevailing risks, it was seen to be a risk too much to take with the taxpayers' money. And so for that reason, they presented the recommendations to the shareholder and in turn onto the subcommittee. I'll close there, Chair, and hand back to you and perhaps for the company directors to add.
Let me just check first whether people have questions purely to ensure they've understood what we've heard from Chris. This is not getting into comment or discussion, just clarification. Paul.
Thank you. Just one small point, Chris. PWLB in November. What happened in November on the PWLB?
Two things happened in November. Firstly, November 2019, the PWLB rate went up by 1%. And then in November 2020, it came down again. But that was after Moranton had made their decision. But then, and Caroline can have the technical detail here, Treasury guidance around PWLB loans from November 2020 was strengthened such that loans for the purposes of generating a profit had significant strings attached, and there was significant strengthening of the guidance about the circumstances in which that was allowed. But I'll let Caroline add the detail.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So I think in reaction to Spelthorne Council and a few other district councils, they had gone out and bought some office accommodation and had seriously extended their borrowing levels and utilised PWLB rates to buy these assets. That was deemed to be outside of our prudential framework. And you'll have seen as part of the Cabinet report, which came on Monday, we have a draft Treasury management strategy, which sets out various prudential indicators and sets out our overall borrowing limits that we're allowed to apply for and what levels we must stay within to make sure that any future borrowing is affordable for council tax levels. So I think as a way of clamping down on that, and I think there was also quite a lot of pushback from private companies because local authorities were stepping into their area and their arena. There was also fear that local authorities chasing properties were pushing the prices up. So what was decided was that the freedoms of the PWLB were going to be restricted. So on the 26th of November, guidance was issued, which said that we would no longer be able to borrow from the Public Works Loan Board for the purposes of yield. And not only for the purposes of yield, but if we had anything in our future capital programme, which then required yield, which was going to have capital expenditure for the purposes of yield, we would not be able to have any other borrowing in there. So they've really clamped down on what we will be able to use that for. And as the Articles of Association for the company say, and it was set up purely for the purposes of delivering a profit or delivering dividends or delivering interest return back to the authority to enable us to protect other services, it was deemed that this would not apply to a housing company of this nature.
Thank you. Nick, Councillor McLean, you had just for clarification here, yeah?
What's clarification? Chris Lee referred to construction costs being wrong. At what stage were they wrong? Were they recently due to market conditions, or is that actually at the base set up back in 2017?
So just to be clear, I didn't say that they were wrong. All of these things are based on assumptions and market evidence and advice. So at the start of Moranton's journey in March 2017, they prepared a business plan which set out, based on the expert advice at that time, assumptions about the direction of travel for construction costs and for rental income. And over time, they update and refresh those assumptions based on further advice, and that advice is based on market conditions. And as we've seen, that advice changed, which meant that the business plan changed and the return to the council was significantly reduced. So none of these were wrong. It's the circumstances changed over that period of time and changed in an adverse way, so deteriorating the business plan.
Fine. If there are no further questions at this point, Councillor Gretton.
Really quick one. Just in terms of the purpose of the company, I know you're saying everyone's saying its purpose was to make a profit, but I thought when you read some of the documents, it says quite clearly the purpose of Moranton was to increase the housing supply and be the exemplar landlord and more affordable housing and all this sort of thing, and that also creates a profit. So did anyone actually write to the Public Works Loan Board to say, look, we are a housing company, our purpose is increasing the supply of housing and affordable housing and rental housing in Merton and so on. Yes, we also wish to make a profit, but our primary purpose is housing. On that basis, will the Public Works Loan Board finance us with its extremely low interest rate? It may be worth clarifying that with the loan board, because it depends how you ask the question to them, and it may influence how they respond.
So Caroline may wish to add to this, but the first thing to say, the objectives of the company were to build housing, yes, but with the sole purpose of delivering a return, a profit to the council. Quite different from other housing companies, it wasn't set up to deliver affordable housing. It was set up to deliver policy compliant housing, which meant that consistent with the council's policies, an element of affordable housing would be part of that, if viable. And I'd underline the words if viable, because what Moranton showed was that actually the delivery of large amounts of affordable housing wasn't viable, but the company continued to provide some because it was a local authority owned company, and that ate away at its developers' profit and clearly affected some of that viability. But the company's objectives were not about delivering affordable housing, and the company doesn't have and has never had a direct relationship with the Public Works Loan Board, which is entirely for the council and for the council to decide how it funds the housing company, either through capital that it owns or through borrowing. That's where I'll hand over to Caroline to add to the nature of the PWLB relationship.
So if I would take you back to the original document which went to Cabinet and to Council in 2017, principles said that the company would be commercially focused with the object of developing properties for rent, but also appropriate for sale. The council will maximise the income to the council as its sole shareholder. So I think it's very clear. Don't forget, at the time, the company was only set up to deliver 77 units. So I think to say, it's a housing company, 77 units isn't really going to break the bank or some of what you would call Steve Langley's housing list.
Yeah.
We have not written to the PWLB because the company took the decision that it was no longer viable before that announcement was made. So I do not see the point of going back to PWLB for a decision the company has taken independently of the council to say that it sees itself as no longer viable.
It does refer to the purpose to housing before it talks about profit, and it also refers to the 600 houses and units it was going to build as part of the Morton generation after the initial tranches as well. So it was going to be a lot bigger in terms of its longer term.
But they would always be subject to separate business cases, and clearly they are now no longer going to come forward.
Okay, let me take Councillor Mundy and then come back to Councillor Kohler again.
Chair, thanks very much. Thanks, Chris and Caroline. This question may involve both of you answering or one of you, but I think it'd be helpful if you could sort of cast your mind back and paint us a picture of that time and the decision, and also the rationale. I mean, for many people watching, and maybe some of us here now, we don't understand the sheer change in the financial picture of the authority, and why, how would this, if the picture was actually positive and we weren't and the decision wasn't taken to get off the off-ramp, what could have this delivered if everything was positive? And why was this actually needed? Why was this considered, rather than, as we've just heard from Ed, thinking more of a sort of a building social housing? Why was that commercial focus there?
I mean, the company was established to assist the council's general fund and no other purpose. So we were hoping that over time it would deliver a significant return, or not an insignificant return to the council. It was never going to massively benefit the council taxpayer, but in a modest way, it was going to add to the housing supply and to provide a return. And it was a very creative way of dealing with or benefiting from the difference in which the council could borrow at PWLB rates, lend to an in-house company, and pay back that interest rate and a dividend to the council in turn. And it's fair to say that these things don't just happen overnight. Moranton were quite properly tracking changes in the operating environment, good and bad, over the whole period of the tenure and the steering of the company. And it was only in the summer and autumn of last year that sort of decision started to emerge as a real, firm, logical and likely conclusion. So it wouldn't be true to say that this is something that happened, overnight in the autumn, but one that quite properly the company was keeping an eye on for some time, but which came to a head at this point. And it's particularly important to note that it came to a head at a time when the council's financial position is changing because of the operating environment that we're in. And so I can absolutely sit behind the recommendation that was presented to the subcommittee and fully appreciate and understand the decision that Moranton came to.
Councillor Kohler?
Thank you. Caroline, can I just press you on this one point? The PWLB rate went down in October, and Chris and you have both made reference to the fact that was important in October 2019. Now, the decision was made, then two things happened. The PWLB rate went down again in November, and they tightened the criteria. Clearly, the board had made a decision by then, but that's not cast in stone. Are you telling me there was no discussion about, look, two things have happened. The rate's gone down. We thought that was important when it went up. They've tightened the criteria. Do we need to consider this now? I see no evidence of any discussion or any reference to it, no emails. Two relevant things happened. Relevant to the decision initially, why before the subcommittee made the decision, was there not discussion about the changing criteria, things that had happened after the decision had been made by the board?
So there was a gap of almost a year between the change in interest rates. So that was significant. But I think there was some sensitivity analysis done originally around levels of interest rates and what that might achieve. But the fact then PWB changed the goalpost, said that we would not be allowed to lend to the company. If the company did not have any assets, they would not get a loan from anyone else other than the council. So you'd have, that's then a question for the viability of the company. I don't think it changes the viability of the company.
So I'm not asking to go over the decision again. I'm looking at the principles of decision making. What I'm asking is, where is the evidence that was discussed or considered? These are two relevant changes after the board made a decision. What I'm looking for is not to second guess the decisions. I want to see how decisions are made. Where is the evidence that was considered? What was it considered at all?
From my point of view, I think the fact that there was no return to the council from either the interest rates or dividends to the company, from the company, until the assets were sold in 30 years' time, that change in interest rate would have had no relevance on the decision of the company.
Okay, I want to move us along. Can I ask? No, Nick, you want to?
Thank you, Chair. I just quickly to follow up from Councillor Kohler. You talk about the company having no assets. Was it ever considered to transfer the land that was actually held by the council into the company? The council is 100% shareholder, therefore that company would have assets. And I have to say, I find it quite astounding that borrowing at 2.96%, we can't return a profit. I mean, compared to commercial rates, that is rock bottom.
Well, there's two questions there. One I can only answer, well, one is for the company, I think, to answer. Why would we transfer our assets to a company that is no longer sound and viable? So the decision, we were always going to wait until the right time to transfer the properties to the company. and that clearly that decision point hadn't been reached. And then because it would have affected the gearing of the company for loan purposes, because the valuation of the lands from when we originally did the business case has dropped from 8.1 million to 4.9 million.
Is that a residual valuation as well?
No, that's just the current valuations that have been put based on planning permission.
So that's,
Well,
I just assumed that because it had gone down, that was a residual valuation based on the increase of construction costs. So that you're saying that that's actually just the land value with planning.
Correct.
Let me move us along. Councillor Allison, do you want to come in at this point to, as you were the cabinet member for finance at that stage?
Well, I can do. I had something that you that we said about preparing for you. Is that what you would like?
Yes, please, and then we can turn to discussion and questions. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you've asked us or you've been asked to look at the decision by the company to close, and that decision was looked at and noted in December by the council subcommittee, which I chaired after the company had concluded it was no longer a going concern. Obviously, the directors are here tonight to explain their rationale and the timing of their decision, which is what's been asked for. But I also think whilst I'm here, it's helpful to remind ourselves why the company was formed and acknowledge its achievements. So it was set up explicitly to help the council reduce the impact of austerity. Like many councils, we wanted to take advantage of the low interest rates we enjoyed then to build homes, with rental income being used to reduce cuts to services, while at the same time, much needed housing could be planned. But by setting up Moranton with the explicit purpose of helping subsidise council services, we showed the council was willing to take calculated risks at a time when local authorities were being encouraged to be entrepreneurial. However, these were calculated risks, and that is why we deliberately included several jumping off points when we could reassess the strategy. Last summer, Moranton completed the first key part of its objective to take 4 difficult sites and get approval for housing, including affordable homes for our residents. By doing so, it increased the value of the sites compared to if it didn't have planning permission. And in particular, by adding 21 social housing units to the borough's future supply, it will generate significant financial benefits for the council, as well as change the lives of 21 families. Now, whatever the merits of the decision to close, I think it would be, of their decision to close, I think it would be helpful tonight if we could extend our thanks to Moranton staff for securing planning permission and obtaining these financial benefits for the council. The Conservative call-in says the company's decision was taken with limited notice, but it was stated many times planning application was a jumping off point. We drew attention to this at the subcommittee meeting in October, where I also warned about the impact on Moranton of changes to the housing market. Before the subcommittee in December, I also ensured that councillors who asked were given full background briefings into the company's decision. I also took the unusual step of inviting you, Chair, to address the committee, and your concerns were considered at great length, something I know you found helpful. Now, I don't speak on behalf of the company, but it strikes me many things have changed since it was established for it to conclude it should close. Among these, Chris has gone through a number of them, but the government is now more hostile to governments, to councils borrowing in order to make investments that generate returns and allow us to reduce our cuts. Borrowing rates have gone up and down, and questions have been introduced about whether we can borrow at all. Next, the economy is much changed. While not necessarily, as Chris says, the biggest factors, Brexit, which has been far more chaotic than even the Leave campaign said it would be, and coronavirus have had a huge impact on the economy. And economic factors have affected construction costs and rental returns. Also, we obviously have to take into account what's happening to similar companies at other councils. Nottingham has been forced to wind up its energy company, and austerity has brought Croydon Council to the precipice. So these 3 factors, among others, will have impacted Moranton hugely, while the risks became even more unpredictable. And as a public sector company with no capital or assets, I imagine Moranton couldn't take the same risks as the private sector, and its explicit purpose, which was to make money now to help the council reduce cuts, couldn't be guaranteed. So we're fortunate that Moranton had not gone into the next phase where construction costs really add up before these difficulties rose. However, just to finish, I think it's important to say I continue to believe these schemes still offer very attractive opportunities for established developers and housing associations who have easier access to credit or can use their own capital to build. Now, for them, I would say Merton is a great place and developers will get a lot out of their investments, while the value of the sites, which has been significantly enhanced by Moranton's work, can still help the council's fight balances, and we will get good quality housing. So I hope you'll conclude tonight that the company has made the decision for rational reasons, which we understand and we noted. And I hope that you will actually thank them for the work that they've done to assist the council in its objectives, which were initially, as we said, to stop the effect of austerity. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Strauss. And yes, I'm happy to confirm I was pleased to have the opportunity to address the subcommittee before it took the decision, which was then, as you rightly say, analysed at some length before the decision was taken. I think we now need to start looking at the grounds for the call-in and coming to a view on those. Can I start with a presumption in favour of openness? Councillor Crowe has set out the reasons why he feels that wasn't followed. Do I have views as to why they feel that the decision was taken in an open manner? Anybody want to comment on that? Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, there's always a temptation to try and remake the decision. I want to look at the principles of decision making and openness here. Now, I hear what you say, Councillor Southgate and Councillor Allison, but let's remember the only reason I and you got a briefing and you spoke to the committee was because I asked what's happening here. That was going to happen. Before that, there was no openness at all. There was no discussion with scrutiny. Now, there's reference in the report to pre-decision scrutiny would have been possible, but you were in a hurry. But from July, from the minutes from July, you knew there was going to be, you were examining the business case again. I do not begin to understand why there was not pre-decision scrutiny, discussion with scrutiny. You all know, full well, had I not sent that email, we wouldn't have had that briefing the day of the meeting, nor would Peter have been addressing the committee. Now, why I don't begin to understand why scrutiny wasn't involved. This is not a political point. This is a point about how scrutiny functions in this council.
Can I invite somebody to respond to that as to why?
Chair, could I? If I could just say a little, and the company may wish to, and Councillor Cole is right, the company was considering its review from July onwards, and quite rightly, but to have that review played out in public is not the way that companies operate, and the company needs to operate and be treated just the same as any other development company, and that's how we set it up. The decision was ultimately one for the subcommittee to be taken in public, not for Moranton's operation to be displayed and operated in public. So I think I draw a distinction there in the way in which the company needs to be treated and the transparency around its company operations.
Can I come back on that? Pre-decision scrutiny is not a public. Pre-decision scrutiny is a discussion with scrutiny panel members. That doesn't have to be in public if it's confidential. As you know, I'm talking about pre-decision scrutiny. I'm not talking about something like this, which, it's all too late, apart from learning some lessons for the future. Now, I still don't see why confidentiality requires us to not talk to scrutiny.
Chair, could I just have one further contribution
Yes.
to that? 'Cause I do hear the force of Councillor Kohler's argument, but there was no pre-decision to scrutinise until November, December. No decision had been taken, and the company was considering the matters. And so to that extent, it might feel like a minor point or a trick, but there simply was no decision to scrutinise.
Pre-decision scrutiny, Chris. Pre-decision scrutiny happens before the decision.
Sorry, I do take that point, but well, I'm in danger of repeating myself about the way in which a company operates in private.
Can I invite other contributions on this question of openness and transparency? Aidan, you come in, please.
Thanks, Chair. Just clarifying on that, because it's just an important distinction to make, and I know this is unusual territory for us because being the sole shareholder. So, Chris, again, risk of repeating yourself. So clearly, there's not a mechanism for pre-scrutiny of a company. If you're a company, you have a meeting as a company and you decide, you research, you have a discussion, you base it on fact, you make that recommendation to your shareholders or your owner, and then that is at the point where if a decision needs to be made, then it's there. And from the timings we've outlined, and we're talking about sort of December time really, and then we are where we are now. So clearly, it wouldn't be a pre-decision scrutiny for anything commercial because there would not be a pre-decision. That's not how companies operate. Is that just clarifying what you said?
It is, and it is a fine point, and maybe I'm in danger of overstating it. But until such time as the company had made its decision, there was just business considerations. There was no decision that they were planning to take. They were looking at the evidence, assessing whether the business case had changed, and reached that conclusion. And I think if I can better understand what Councillor Kohler is asking for, is that should have been played out in a scrutiny forum and to look at the evidence that the company was looking at in order to consider whether the decision that they might take should be taken. Well, I don't think that's the way in which a company working for the council should be treated, in the way in which a company that we set up to act like a private company, which needs to consider business decisions in private. But when they are reaching a conclusion, which they did, brought that to the council as soon as possible. And I don't think there was a space there for pre-decision scrutiny, apart from right at the very last stage in December. And that, as I've explained earlier, wouldn't have fitted well with their audit requirements and the need for them to show a going concern. And these are probably questions more for the company than from the council. So I'm having to present the way in which the company dealt with these.
James, do you want to comment from or indeed Mark, from the perspective of, no, it would be of the company and that aspect of commercial confidentiality?
Sorry, but just make an additional point to what Chris was saying, and Chris is obviously the the more important point, but the other one as well is it's very difficult for us, and we wouldn't dream of doing it as an administration, of telling scrutiny what to scrutinise and what to do pre-scrutiny of. And I think it's fair to say that the subcommittee, which is not really the decision-making body the company would have been, but the subcommittee did flag on several occasions the upcoming jumping off point and that a review would be made. And we spoke on several occasions at those meetings and at other meetings about the volatility of the housing market. And I think Caroline has spoken before at other meetings about the Public Works Loans Board. I think it might even have been at the Commission. So I don't think we could have told you what to do or what was going to happen. And I think that you should probably be slightly fair to us that the moment, like literally the moment that we realised that there was an issue and that scrutiny wanted some sort of involvement, we went very far out of our way to involve members in the decision. And I think that that by involving you, we strengthened the decision, showed that the decision was actually right. But Chris's point is much more important because it's about we can't tell the company what to do. But in terms of the administration telling Scrutiny what to do pre-decision scrutiny on, I don't think that would be a precedent that you'd like to go down. However, we did allow Scrutiny involvement at the very moment that we could.
James, do you want to add anything as a director of the company? And then I think we need to come to a view on this point.
I think there's, Chair, if I may, there's probably a few guiding principles that the company operated under that are worth just stating, because I think it helps understand how the company reached decisions which were independent of the council. It was set up as a commercial company, and we very much worked on the basis that it was to return both a dividend and a debt financing benefit to the company, and that what we needed to do was to operate in a manner that allowed us to work to achieve the best value, but understanding that we were a company that perhaps others would be looking to in terms of setting the standards of some of those developments. However, one of the key issues I think that the company would need to sort of remind resolve is that in addition to the decision making, and that it was a commercial company, it was also bound by state aid guidance, and that was an important part of the initial report when the company was approved. And that puts a lot of obligations on the company by way of gearing. It had to have commercially obtainable borrowing rates in the market, and therefore it was having to be judged as a startup company, and the borrowing rates, its gearing, were all determined by would it look like a company that was operating independently of a local authority in all aspects. And we were guided by those principles. So when the company, during its operations, and that includes the periods of procurement, design and development, and ultimately its QSing, its costing of the schemes, always was aiming to get the best value outcome. But it did recognise that what it had to do was to return against its business plan objectives, which were based on the principles of it being a state aid compliant company. And when we started flagging that as we were getting through planning, we started to get greater certainty on the cost of construction because we were working through more detailed designs. We were seeing at that point that there were cost increases. Those were coming through from planning obligations that other private sector companies would be bound by, not just the company. And we also saw that the market was starting to see increases in cost for a variety of reasons. We ran those numbers through our business plan in terms of how that was set against the income projections. And we constantly monitored that. We constantly sought to get the best value for construction and to get the best rent that we could based on the standards of the properties we were developing. But when it became evident that that wasn't going to make a return that would look like it was something that was supportable, we, as a company, took the decision that that was something that we, myself and Roger as fellow directors, wouldn't be able to support under our fiduciary duties. We raised that with the shareholder. We did that. We kept the shareholder abreast through the regular subcommittee reports. But I think it shows that at its heart, it was something that we had seen coming through the system in terms of the cost increases. But what it did was create a financial operating environment where it wasn't tenable that we could continue as a company that would be regarded as being guided by state aid rules. And then I think Roger would be able to say, well, how that, as we were going through our audit and accounts preparation period, that came into focus because it was something that, as a going concern, we would have to report on.
Thank you, James. Ed, and then I think we are going to move to a decision on this particular point.
Yeah, really quick one. It could be, maybe I'll ask James again because he's the company director who seems to have made the decision that it wasn't viable. So just in terms of openness, though, all the papers before us talk about the business plan and there being jump off points. Keep hearing that it was always intended to have jump off points, but my recollection of the business plan is actually said the opposite. So if there is a reference to a jump off point, as the papers before us say there is, it'd be good, I'm not asking you to actually point us to it right now, but maybe you can circulate that afterwards. It would be good to point out what they are, because my recollection of the business plan is that it said the opposite, and it said that this is a long-term investment for housing. There are going to be market fluctuations. Interest rates are going to increase sometimes and decrease. That's what, and there's mechanisms in there. There's a risk management process to maybe divest one or two of the units or adjust the interest rate a little bit. We're still within the risk management level of the interest rate fluctuations, which are 3.8% set out in that business plan, is my recollection. And so, you know, where are those jump off points? So why aren't you working with the sensitivity analysis that was in the original business plan that says it's long term and the market's going to fluctuate and interest rates might go up? And why aren't you applying those market sensitivity risk management, you know, measures which were set out in the business plan to deal with the situations we've just been discussing?
So, Chair, the company, as a matter of course, was regularly reviewing its costs and its income. It was doing sensitivity analysis on that. But I think the outcome was that with the position as post-planning in terms of cost and income, and with sensitivity analysis, it wasn't showing either the gearing or the ability to have funding commercial rates that would be available in the market. And for that reason, it wasn't able to cover its debt, and that was a deviation from the original business plan. That cost savings and income projections that were, I think, constantly reviewed to make sure they were prudent, wasn't able to overcome. So it was certainly the case that we did sensitivity analysis as a matter of course, just as we did try to pare down construction costs. We recognised that there were ceilings in income, as there always will be in terms of lettable monthly rates. But it came to the point where it was not able to cover its debt. It wasn't able to show gearing that would be seen as a state aid compliant company, and that was something that was a point where, as directors of the company, we had to recognise that's not something we could overcome.
Okay, I think actually that addresses the other criterion for decision making, consideration and evaluation of alternatives, actually addressing that more there, James. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is a question for the officers, and it's occurred as I was listening very carefully to what's been said. My understanding is that the council made a decision to set up a commercial company, which was an arm's length company with directors who had to act in accordance with company law. And we now appear to be asking the question, why didn't the decisions comply with the normal processes that the council has for managing its own business? Well, if the council makes that decision in the first place, and I assume that was done, and perhaps Louise could help us with that, then how can it expect the company to comply with the procedures that wouldn't apply to a commercial company?
Louise, can
Well, I can help on the first bit. I might need you to ask the second bit again, Councillor McCabe. So in fact, the Cabinet agreed to set up the company. The Council endorsed that right back in April 2017. But just to be a legal pedant for a moment, it was a Cabinet decision to establish the company. But James is quite right that the company having been established, it needs to comply with all the rules and regulations that govern private companies, and it has to do that as a separate entity, and the directors have to act in the interests of the company, albeit they happen to be council employees, and they're both here tonight. So I think that's answered your question, but happy to help again if I've got the wrong end of the stick.
Okay, yeah. Paul again. Yeah.
I do feel my point's being misunderstood. I'm sure not deliberately. Clearly, we can't scrutinise the workings of a separate company. We should be able to scrutinise once that recommendation is made, but before the decision is made. Pre-decision scrutiny is all about that. Councillor Allison knows that nothing would have happened at all had I not raised it initially. But when was the decision made by the company? Can we have an actual date? When was the decision communicated?
So the date I've got, Chair, is the 12th of November.
So,
sorry, I think the decision, the in-principle decision of the company was probably slightly before that, but that was when that decision was presented to the shareholder representatives.
So my point is, why was scrutiny not involved in that 6 weeks or so, or that at least that 4 weeks or so? That's the point. To say there wasn't time is clearly ridiculous. Clearly there was time to bring in scrutiny then. And if this council took the scrutiny seriously, they would have immediately said, this needs to be, we need everyone in on this. This is not a political issue. We need everyone in on this. This needs to be scrutinised. Of course, and for Councillor Allison to say it's not for him to tell us what to scrutinise, pre-decision scrutiny requires the council to be transparent about what it's going to decide or what it's planning to decide. Of course, we should have been brought in then.
Now, let me come to Ben. Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chair. I might be out of the bounds of the openness of the decision making here and kind of creeping in, as I think many speakers have done, in terms of the alternatives as well. But if I kind of think there was, in terms of the jump off points being presented to the subcommittee in multiple times, I'm kind of convinced of myself on that point. But in terms of the company making the decision itself, would, with the original intention for us to have an arm's length company law, organisation that makes its own decisions, would we as a council, whatever level of scrutiny and whatever shape or form of it, have been able to change that decision at that point? I'm confused at that stage, especially as, just to add from my own understanding of a profit-making company's motives, that if there's any risk of it being a not going concern, that its duty to its shareholders at that point is to close down and to proceed on that basis.
I can come in and help on that point. Councillor Butler's right. If the directors are of the view that the company is not a going concern, the directors need to make a decision about whether to either wind the company up or, as is more likely in this case, go for a voluntary strike off on the basis it won't trade for 3 months. So it's a wholly owned company, so it's disingenuous to expect the council wouldn't have a role in it. But that decision, as a matter of law, is one for the directors.
Louise, can I ask you for some guidance here? The one of the two criteria on which this is being challenged is that the decision maker acts with a presumption in favour of openness. Does this then hinge on the question of who is the decision maker?
Well, I think the decision that's under review tonight is the decision of the subcommittee to endorse the view of the directors that the company should cease trading effectively. So it's legitimate for this body to review it. When it comes to openness, I wasn't involved in the drafting of those grounds of decision making. This is not a case where the decision was taken in private. Councillor Kohler rightly challenges whether or not more pre-decision scrutiny could have happened, but there's been no breach of the requirements as to access of information or advance notice of the decision or anything of that sort. It was taken in open session. So those are matters, I think, for this committee to weigh in the balance when they conclude whether or not there was a breach of that principle of decision making.
So let's take that criterion first. Did the subcommittee act in a manner to demonstrate that they are a presumption in favour of openness? So we're focusing on the subcommittee. Can I have all those who believe that they did act in that spirit? So that's 4. Can I just confirm? Yes. And against that, those who
That's 5.
Sorry?
5.
I actually counted 6.
All right, let's have it again. I certainly don't want to get this wrong. That the committee did act in a spirit of openness. One hand, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is 6.
It's 8, Chair.
And who, against that, the subcommittee did act in a spirit of openness.
Mr. Chair, I just need to know, am I eligible to vote? I need to know, am I eligible to vote? I'm not sure.
No, it's not an educational matter, is it, Mansour? So, no, I think it's the case you can't.
Can you remind us if Ros is eligible to vote?
No, again, as our C of E rep, as it were, she is not.
There was only 5 votes then.
So I'm saying against the, they don't believe in action in the spirit of openness, the subcommittee, and I'm going to put my own name to that. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's come to the, so that there is no agreement to refer back to Cabinet on that presumption of openness. Consideration and evaluation of alternatives. I think we've heard enough to better come to a judgment on that from what we've heard both from, Chris and
I appreciate that any liability based on the wind-up will depend on what the land is sold for, but they must have a valuation, or the directors must have a valuation today. So as it stands based on the valuation, what is there a liability to the council? I'd like clarification on that, because I think the point was covered earlier and just said, well, we'll hope to sell at top market. Well, that's fine, but a decision was made. We've heard all about the variables and how much weight has been put on those. So I'd like to understand, based on the valuations today, what is the liability, if any, to the council?
So perhaps if I could respond on that, Chair. And the best answer that we have is that we have 2 valuations, one before planning consent was granted and one by the same firm of valuers after planning consent was granted, and they were both within a period of, I think, 6 months. And they show an increase in the value of around 1.9 million. Now, these are valuations, they're estimates. So we won't know the true value that the council receives until these markets are sold. If you then set aside that, the £2.1 million that the council has incurred for secondment costs and consultants, then you would arrive at a conclusion that there's a potential loss of £200,000. But that is all based upon valuations and estimates set against the true costs that the council has incurred in increasing the value of these sites through the planning consent that we've achieved. And as I say, we won't know, the council won't know until such time as these sites are sold. And in terms of the alternatives, the slides included in the appendices show 4 options. Clearly there are infinite options, or close to, there's certainly more than 4 options available. And the option chosen, option 2, which Moranton recommended and ultimately concluded, is the one that shows the best marginal return to the council at that point. And if I could just, Chair, whilst I'm speaking, just to, I failed to respond to one of Councillor Crow's points, and I think it's important that I do, just for the record, because Councillor Crow made a point that the company hadn't submitted its accounts to Companies House. And I've just checked with Companies House records, and I can see from their website that all the accounts are up to date, and the next set of accounts due isn't due until March 2021, according to the Companies House website.
Chair, if I may clarify that point, the accounts for the financial year ending 2020 are currently being audited. It was hence part of the preamble in the reports that you've received tonight around the necessity to advise the auditors of the company's decision, bearing in mind that audit is currently going through. It would normally be a deadline of the end of the calendar year, the 31st of December. But because of COVID, Companies House have extended, government have extended the responsibility to table accounts by 3 months. That takes it up, the deadline up to the 31st of March 2021. So they are currently being audited, and they will be filed within that due deadline.
Thank you, Roger. Let me come then to the second of the two criteria, in some ways made more straightforward. Was there a consideration and evaluation of alternatives? And can I ask all those members to show who believe that that has been demonstrated? In which case the decision is not referred back. So let me just get this right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mansour, sorry again, I have to discount your vote. One. I've only got 5, is that? Billy, can you confirm that we've got 5 here?
I can see 6.
Let me do this again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe my screen. There you are, Ben, down there. Yes, 6. 6 believe that the decision has demonstrated a consideration of alternatives, in which case there are no grounds for referring it back to Cabinet, and the call-in falls. Thank you all. I think what it does reveal is the difficulties around decisions taken by arm's length bodies, so that our process is transparent within the council. For commercial reasons, the decisions taken by the commercial body, the company, are not as open to scrutiny as we would expect for a decision that the council took. Thank you anyway, and thank all of you who've supported that James, Roger, Chris, and Caroline, but don't go away, Caroline. Good, let's, Rosie, can I just check, you haven't heard from Jed at all?
No, I haven't received anything.
No,
Chair.
okay. So we go on to look at the budget. Just check my running order on that. I'm going to ask, because we're in a more complicated situation with not 2 but 3 rounds of scrutiny for the budget this year, and I'm going to ask Caroline to update us, if you would, Caroline. If you could reference, though, the Cabinet meeting on Monday, although we don't have the papers for that yet, and we will be looking at it at our 3rd and final budget scrutiny meeting on the 17th of February. But because the numbers are changing quite a lot here, I think we need to be at least cited on those at a high level.
Certainly, Chair, and thank you. So certainly at the last scrutiny meeting, you did have the advantage over the panels in that you got the sort of November Cabinet, you had the savings, but you didn't have the draft equality assessments. So certainly they came back to the December Cabinet, and they were then presented as in part of the information pack, which you all got, I think, sort of in between Christmas and New Year. So COVID may have had an impact on us, but at least you still got your information pack from us. So that information pack includes the detailed savings, which went to the November and December Cabinet. It includes the draft equality assessments. It included the service plans, which have been revised for this year as well. So hopefully you have had a chance to look through that. We then had obviously the further December paper, which showed movement in the gap and some of the assumptions, and gave an update on the spending review from the LGA, just to give us some of the headlines. We did not get the actual settlement for the local authority until the 17th of December, which is why there was still a lot of work to be done on what we then brought forward to Cabinet on Monday night. So knowing some of the intricacies of when we might get some information and how we made sure that you were included in what was going on, there was indeed a third round of scrutiny this night. Savings went to Cabinet on Monday night because they do not have the opportunity of a further meeting before final Cabinet on the 22nd of February. Their next meeting is until the day after that. So whilst they have gone through their savings, I won't be going through in detail the savings which went to Cabinet on Monday night. They'll come through on the 17th of February for you to consider. So you've got some more time to look at that, and we'll get sort of whether we have a formal report sent out to you to make sure that we're all on the same page for what needs to be done. So certainly we did have an update on our council tax base for the December Cabinet, and had some information about changing in some of the assumptions. And also we had some information on the taxi card and freedom pass. So you will see that at that meeting, we were left with a gap still of 11.7 million, rising to 12.7 million over the life of the MTFS. So clearly, if some of you have had a chance to look at the papers which came on Monday night to Cabinet, that does have some of the headline information then from the settlement. Not all of the grants that we think we will get have actually been announced yet. They are coming through, not necessarily in all in one go. And we have made a plea, please can we have the amount of grants as early as possible, and ideally before we set the budget on the 22nd of February. So with some of the settlement information, some additional COVID funding that we was a nice bonus for us, and what was also a local council tax support scheme grant to offset some of the additional costs that most local authorities have faced through, I think, increase of residents claiming universal credit and therefore being eligible for support for those local council tax support schemes. However, quite a lot of that funding is again only one-off because the spending review was 1 year only, and we're trying to see whether, again, because COVID, I think the impact of COVID is going to be longer lasting in 21-22 than we thought it would be. So we'll be working closely with MHCLG colleagues to keep an eye on the additional COVID grants that we've got to see if it's going to be sufficient for the purposes as we go through. The settlement and that was announced really before the machinery of lockdown, national lockdown occurred, and we're beginning to see, and we'll be reporting in February, some of the impacts, particularly on our parking income of that further, certainly month of lockdown is having on our parking income. There is some additional sales fees and charges grant to come for the first 3 months of 21-22. That's not been included at this stage because we need to do some further work around grant being claimed to date, and also clarifying the basis on which that grant will be based, because we've already made some assumptions about loss of grant. So are we going to be sort of doubly penalised because of taking into account COVID, and then is it a COVID effect? So we will be doing some further work for the February Cabinet as well. We have also done some updated figures for the dedicated schools grant. And as I said at Cabinet on Monday night, we are hoping that is the worst case scenario. There is work which kicked off this morning with colleagues from Children's Schools and Families and from Finance, looking at the plan. I won't call it a recovery plan because if you've seen the Cabinet report, you know that we're definitely not recovering that deficit at this stage. But we do hope to have some actions and some understandings to actually look at the supply and demand, cost impact, banking, and what neighbouring boroughs are doing to try and get that deficit down. We have also used some of our reserves to offset that gap in 21-22. And from the latest monitoring that we had utilised an anticipated underspend again to reduce that gap. But as you are fully aware, Chair, those use of reserves are normally one-off and they will have impacts in future years. So you will see that the gap, whilst we currently have a balanced budget in 21-22, the gap does rise to 5.9 million in 22-23 and up to 14.7 million in 24-25. So additional savings were brought forward to that cabinet meeting, along with draft quality assessments, and they'll be what are going through the other scrutiny panels, and we'll be back in front of you on the 17th of February for you in particular to go through corporate services and obviously the feedback from the other panels as to their views and thoughts on the proposals in front of you tonight. I'm quite happy to take any general questions on the budget and how we've adjusted for the MTFS before we then go through in detail the proposals that are in front of you tonight from corporate services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Do we have any questions for Caroline on what she's just briefed us on? Yes, Ed.
Just a quick one, Caroline. I think you've confirmed this, but the spending review, if I understand it correctly, the 75, all the extra money that Robert Jenrick's been funding for the council's losses and so on. I know my understanding is there's still two pretty sizable tranches which we expect from that. One is for this financial year, for the this quarter, effectively, to take us to the end of the financial year. So we haven't seen that number yet, finalised and reflected in this year's this year's numbers, but also for the new financial year, for the budget year. I know you're saying we've already closed the gap down to zero, but my understanding is that whatever Robert Jenrick's funding gives to cover the company, to cover the council's losses, has not yet been included in that projected budget gap either for the new financial year as well. Is that right?
So for the monitoring report for the December cabinet, we've got the two tranches of income grant in, but it states we've got some difficulties with reconciling that information with the other returns we do for MHCLG on a monthly basis. So there is no allowance at this stage because at first glance, it looked like we may have to repay some of the grant that we originally got. So that was a bit of a concern. So we have not put any further monies in for that stage. As I just said in my introduction, we have not allowed for any sales fees and charges grant at this stage. We're doing some further work on that, but there will be further changes and updates to the collection fund, which for any small businesses out there or business owners will know the impact that's going to have and be quite challenging on trying to work out the effect of that on our collection fund. The collection fund will bring together all council tax income or business rates income, and either show how much is due to us or from us from the government and the GLA. We've had some calls out to the GLA because some of the initial workings that we're doing for that, because it's based on a return which is due back to MHCLG at the end of the month. Because of the Section 31 or the reliefs that businesses got directly, it's throwing some very strange numbers up and saying that our deficit is 47 million on the collection fund account. Clearly, that is quite a scary number, and we want to do some further work on that before that blows our complete MTFS out of kilter. So there will be further changes to the numbers when they come back in February. I can assure you that they will be very different then. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick questions. In the Cabinet Papers, you refer to a £10.7 million COVID fund. Is that money that we've received in excess of the actual expenditure related, COVID-related expenditure? You mentioned about a piece of work on you're currently undertaking on the 75p in the pound loss of income. When will that work be completed? Will we have sight of that prior to our next round of budget scrutiny? And also, I believe in the previous CYP and also Sustainable Communities, when asked that the cost of Councillor Allison's day off for staff was £300,000. Is that correct?
All right. So the 10.7 million COVID fund includes grants that was received during 1920 at the tail end of the year. We got the first tranche of COVID monies then. We only utilised a very small amount of that, so it was put into the reserves. So that is utilising that money on that basis. We did top it up during the course of the year because we thought if there was some monies received, we put a social care grant into that, which came in late because we thought there was going to be pressures on social care. So some of those monies is the grant that we have received, plus some top-ups that we have already put in place. The 75p in the pound, as I said, will be part of the February report. So there will be some further, both on the monitoring side and on the budget side for 21-22. And the notional cost of the day's leave is roughly £300,000, yes.
Good, thank you. So in summary, the outlook is a little brighter than when we were looking at this back in November. I know you don't like to make sweeping predictions like that, Caroline.
One more question. Is it fair to say then, Director Holland, that the government is doing all that is necessary? And indeed, if we've got a £10.7 million fund in excess of COVID expenditure, they're actually over delivering.
So I did not say it's a 10.7 million COVID fund in excess of expenditure. And indeed, if you look at our monitoring report, you will still see that there is a net cost of COVID in this financial year. We are working through what that will mean, and we are assuming additional costs in next year. However, things have improved from the very early stages, and we have been working hard to get additional funding and claiming for additional expenditure when required. Indeed, we had an announcement of a social care staffing grant on Monday, but it's to be spent by the end of March. So we are saying that, give us some more notice and give us some more freedoms and flexibilities to be able to spend this money, because it's going to be very difficult, whilst it's very needed, to get staff in place or monies out the door to residential homes and care agencies to get those staff in place for 10 weeks. So that's part of the challenge that we have with some of the monies we are receiving, but there is still a net cost to the council in this year from COVID. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me come to Aidan, Brenda, and then we're going to look at the savings in detail.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think staff have done an incredible, fantastic job, and if a day is the very least we can give them. Returning to that, though, about staffing and the true cost of COVID, from my experience in the NHS, working on testing and vaccinations, there is a huge amount of toil being built up and a huge amount of excess work being done. That is through goodwill and various other things, and yes, overtime. Part of that calculation, are we accounting for all of that and the potential benefit, potential loss, what that would mean? So I'm thinking here, with toil, at some point it needs to be taken back. That means not doing things that we could have done. And also, even if we have to pay that toll back as holiday, are we accounting for that? Because the day in return seems a pretty good deal if we're not.
So we are very conscious of the well-being of our staff and looking at ways in which we can help staff with either if they've suffered bereavement, if they've actually suffered from COVID themselves, or they've got financial difficulties with family pressures as well. Certainly with regards to annual leave, we are to the fact that as staff find the time to take leave, and we are working to see the amount of leave that is outstanding over a certain amount, because we normally have quite strict criteria about carry forward of leave. So we are looking to see whether we need to change the arrangements for carry forward of leave, and also how we can encourage staff to safely take their leave to make sure they focus on their well-being, to enable them to still enjoy their work, but also to be able to recover and be able to benefit from both the relaxation, enjoy what they clearly have a passion for.
Brenda.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Caroline. This is about DSG because it really covers where I sit as a chair. And you're saying that the government is not giving us any clarity. However, if you listen to what Aidan has just said, and I think we all know, staff seems to not be in school, so it looks as if we're not spending any money, but that's not quite right. Because there are other high needs who are there all the time, and they've just added to that in that children without laptops and other things are now considered to be part of those high needs. So what can we do to encourage the government to think and to give us the funding that's necessary?
So certainly as part of the DFE, they came out to visit us. I think in 2019. They were meant to have followed up, I think, with all authorities who had a deficit recovery plan in place. But I think they've struggled with either sort of complexities and getting round to people. So they were visited 7 authorities. We have been lobbying hard to make sure that the funding is adjusted, but that at this moment in time, they don't appear to want to change the formula, which is why they've put in place that 3-year statutory override. But as I've sort of said in the report, the statutory override expires on 23-24, at which point, 22-23, at which point our deficit is £69 million. So the statutory override is in place, I think, to help authorities to get their deficit back into balance, whereas clearly we are not at that stage. So that is part of the challenge for us. But it's quite difficult at the moment because of all the focus on COVID and trying to sort of address and making sure that we're getting vulnerable children in school and online learning is taking place. So, but we will be following up and certainly with trying to make the appropriate representation back to the DfE with people who have appeared to be listening before to up the ante again. And indeed, we have said that we think that this is a gap that's been missed from the settlement review. So we're also raising it as part of the London Council's agenda for lobbying for the budget.
Let me come to Councillor Brunt, then I'm going to go to the savings in detail. Mike.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm just seeing a bit of a worrying trend coming from some of the Conservative members here in griping about basically valuing staff, and a thank you to staff for giving time off, because many of us here probably are working from home a lot of the time, and I can be pretty sure that we're putting in more hours in a working day than we would do if we're in the office, because take out the commuting time, for example, but also working to the evenings. And last night at the Sustainable Communities, when Councillor Draper put a resolution commending and thanking the staff who work on the streets and in the parks at keeping the service going through what has been a difficult time, when rightly so we focused on the hard work of teachers, of the medics, of nurses and doctors in hospitals, but actually some of the unsung heroes are those in local authorities that have kept the wheels on the bus. And last night, the Conservative members abstained from that, whereas everyone else voted in favour of it. And I think that we need to move on. And I'm happy that you're saying we're moving on to the next part of the discussion now, because I just wanted to close it off on that and say that I'm just seeing a worrying trend about not valuing staff. And I think it's the difference between leadership and management.
Can I come in on there? First of all, no one is not valuing staff at all. But what we will be putting a reference down tonight, and I'm quite happy to read that out now if you'd like, Councillor Brunt. The OSCC and the reference.
McLean,
we've been accused now, and if I'd like to respond. Now, if we read the reference that's coming in from Sustainable Communities, it's just virtuous. It's not even clear. It's just a nonsense. It wasn't the right forum for that. So can I read the reference we're putting down now, or are we going to?
The council's called it a gimmick. That's why.
Let's just make it clear. I'm not actually proposing to forward any references tonight, because we will be coming back to these matters on the 17th of February. And the Cabinet will not be meeting again to look at the budget or at our references until the 22nd of February. So,
well, okay, Chair. Well, then my position and the Conservatives' position, and I know that Councillor Kohler also fought very hard for local businesses, that that we could not find money to support local businesses, but Councillor Allison can just marry up £300,000, sorry, for an extra day off of staff members, when we should be looking, why can we not then also find the same amount of funding to support local businesses? That's our position, and that is why we have looked at it. Of course we value the staff. Why wouldn't we? We know they do a great job. The point is, we hear time and time again there's no money. Then all of a sudden, Councillor Allison says, I'm going to give this day off. There's a notional cost of £300,000. Well, why can't we find £300,000 for our hard-pressed businesses in Merton? That's our point. And to say that we don't value the staff is just nonsense.
Okay, thank you, Councillor McLean. We will take that referral along with the one from Sustainable Communities last night at our next meeting. I am going to move now to the detail of the savings, which you'll find on pages
11.
12 of your budget pack. Caroline will correct me, but I think I can say we have considered these before. The difference is that you now have the equality impact assessments to sort of justify those, as it were. And in fact, these were, that part of it was drafted by Roger for us. And I don't think any of the proposals give rise for concern in terms of their impact on people with protected characteristics or anything else, do they?
Not, I think there was a 3 on one of our proposals, Chair. But I suppose also you also have the service plans in front of you this time as well, which may give you some context to set in the savings and the equality impacts in place as well. So I would draw your attention to those. And I think obviously there's the capital programme, which again you did consider before, but it's been updated and back in front of you again.
So sorry, can you direct me to the savings that does involve some effect on people with protected characteristics?
So I think it was a staffing saving. I thought it was. Sorry, apologies. I think it's one that's coming out for which went to Cabinet on Monday night.
Okay.
So yes, we have no staffing savings this time round, but I think we do in the next round, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not proposing to go through these in detail, as we have looked at them before, although I do realise a number of members are new, and if you've looked at them and have questions or need to understand them better, do please raise those points, ask those questions. Not seeing anything. And on yes, Aidan.
Hi, no, thanks. Sorry, it's just a matter of process based on what's decided. So, bit of clarity. So we're taking the recommendations from panels when we look at part 2 of the budget as well. Is that correct? Because there was one about service, the service plans. There's one recommendation the panel, my panel made on service plan. So I wanted to know if that was to be taken then as part of part 1 and 2, or now.
I hadn't. Well, Aidan, you tell me. Is it helpful to what we're trying to do right now?
I'm easy if we want to take it all together. I think it's logical to do that. It's just making sure that everyone's happy with that, and you know there's clarity on that, and it aligns with what we're planning tonight.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll take them all together next time. And yes, there are a couple of items that are just, or savings that are deferred. Again, we were happy with them last time, and that they will now impact on a couple of years ahead from where they were.
Yes.
On the capital programme, does anybody have questions? That's on. As affects pages 123, 125.
Councillor Gretton's got his hand up, Chair.
Maybe Caroline, just to clarify that in terms of the memorandum, I know we spoke about Ranton already, some detail tonight, but in terms of the capital elements of the budget, there's quite big chunks coming in this year. I think it's 16 million quid, or then it was moved to sort of 10 million this year and 6 or 7 million. What happens to that? Was that just borrowing now, which doesn't need to happen, or is that being reallocated? So could Caroline just kindly clarify what's happening to that very sizable capital expenditure that had been envisaged as part of the Corporate Services Capital Investment Fund Ranton. That'd be helpful.
So in the papers which went to Cabinet on Monday night, there was a draft capital strategy and a draft treasury management strategy, and the housing company and the benefit to it and the additional capital receipts that we thought we would get have been removed. So therefore the net revenue impact is shown in the Cabinet papers which went on Monday night.
Okay, yeah. So that's capital programme. And does anybody have questions on the service plans? You need good eyesight.
Yes, so normally we lay them round in A3, so apologies that we haven't been able to personally come down and deliver those.
No.
I mean, you get quite a lot of information in those. Sometimes the font is becoming quite small and it's becoming harder to see. And you've got these very helpful pie charts that split out the expenditure. But unless you print them in colour, you can't really see them. Maybe you could use a bar chart. I don't know.
It's a really big screen. So try that next time.
Okay, I think there's really nothing further on the budget at this stage, although there will be more to do when we meet again on the 17th.
Correct.
So our thanks to Caroline.
I've got time for one quick question to Caroline on budget, or not? There's one fight before Caroline goes or not, please. Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you. So, Caroline, the adult social care precept, this is obviously a big thing for residents. It's a 3% increase in council tax. I think we've heard it's not closing a budget gap as such, and there've been quite a bit of extra social care grants coming in from central government. So will you be setting out in the February papers what, I know the cabinet already seems to say, okay, we're going to levy this 3% precept in any event, but no one's actually seen any detail about what it's going to be spent on or why we need it. So are you going to sort of set out a bit of information so we can look at that and scrutinise it, so we understand what that expenditure is intended to cover, exactly why it's necessary, what would happen if we didn't levy the 3% council tax, the extra 3% on council tax? That's obviously a very big part of the budget, so it might be helpful to have quite a bit of information on that so we can scrutinise it.
But certainly from the information that went to Cabinet on Monday, that set out our increase in spending power. The increase in spending power, the government assumes that we will put our council tax up by the maximum allowed, which is the 1.99% plus a 3% adult social care precept. So any monies that we don't put in, then the government have already sort of effectively taken money away from us. And if you have a look at what that spending power shows, that has council tax levels of over £100 million, and yet the council tax levels we're assuming is significantly lower than that. So there'll be a direct loss of income to the authority in future years if we don't put that adult social care precept up. Clearly, we are working through what that monies will be spent on, and whether there'll be full information within the February paper, I cannot say at this stage. We've got some work to do on that, but we can assure you that any monies that are raised from that precept do get spent on adult social care. And indeed, we have been pressing that the adult social care precept should be an actual social care precept, because there are increasing pressures on children's. And we think that there should be more work done in that area as well, whilst we wait for the green paper to come through on the future funding of social care in general.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Good. I think we can draw a close on the budget there. Just take our last but one item is to think about questions for the borough commander when she comes to us in March. I'm not necessarily asking for these now, but do please let Rosie have your questions in good time, because we do like to put them in writing in advance, so they have time to get the facts and figures together for us. I would certainly want to ask the borough commander about her reflections on policing during the pandemic, and in particular the challenges involved in trying to ensure adherence to social distancing regulations. I think that's been quite a trial for the police to handle that sensitively and effectively. But please do remember to to submit your questions in good time. On the work programme, we have our additional meeting on the 17th. I don't know whether that will create a space to get to Jed's delayed presentation. I'll be looking at that, but it's a shame we couldn't hear from him, because I think we really are the only body that is in place both to hear from him, but also to have the opportunity to ask him questions. And we do have a responsibility for the overall health and safety and resilience of our residents. Okay, unless there are any comments on the work programme as it remains, I think I can close the meeting there. All right. And thank you all very much for your attendance here, and particularly to Caroline and to Roger.
Thank you, Chair.